How does the mind interact with the brain? This is a question that Bruce Grayson asked of us 6 years ago, after our paper had been published, first paper. How does it work? You need to work out how it works. To answer to this, we need to have a brief introduction to brain physiology. It's painless, relatively painless. Starting with individual neurons. On the left of this slide, we have an illustration of the main neurons in the cortex. The neurons are directed vertically towards the surface of the brain and are arranged in 6 layers, total about 2.5 millimeters thick. So a very thin layer at the very surface of your brain. These layers of cells comprise the gray matter, the outermost layer of cells in the cortex. We are concerned here with the cells in layers 2 and 3. 2 and 3 are near the surface. I don't know, yes, here we go. So there's 2 and 3. There's a cell at 3, there's a cell at 2. And cells in layer 5 further down. These neurons are called pyramidal neurons, and they have projections called apical dendrites that reach all the way up to the surface. They come from the cell body all the way up to the surface. In the middle figure, we see that the neurons are arranged in mini-columns. The layer 5 cells are arranged in the center, in a central group, surrounded by the layer 2-3 cells. About 100 mini-columns then make up what is called a column, which is about 0.5 millimeter wide. And that's a picture in the cortex. Each cortical column has a specific function in that region of the cortex. For example, the right figure here shows a mapping of the functional columns in a region of the visual cortex that is sensitive to different line orientations in the perceptual field. The columns are color-coded in the figure. They aren't that color in the brain. And for example, red-coded columns are sensitive to horizontal lines. So that's sensitive to horizontal lines, that one is. And the blue ones are sensitive to vertical lines. And the yellow-green are sensitive to lines in the middle, and the darker blue and purple are sensitive to lines that are at an angle. So that's the way the brain is structured, the cortex is structured. So we propose that the interface between the mind and brain occurs in the gray matter at the surface of the neocortex, within the functional columns. So within these set of columns, the mind is interacting. The interface specifically occurs in the apical dendrites of the pyramidal cells, which conveniently stretch towards the surface. Given what is known of the interconnections of the pyramidal cells, we propose that layer 2 and 3, these here, serve as the brain-to-mind or sensory interface, and layer 5 cells here serve as the mind-to-brain interface, or volitional attentional interface. So how this works is that the mind senses the action potentials of layer 2-3 cells via the propagation of action potentials. Similarly, the mind initiates action potentials in layer 5 neurons, again via the apical dendrites. And we suspect that the mechanism for the mind's interaction is via specialized ion channels in the dendrites, a detail you don't need to worry about. When the mind causes these channels to open, the neuron generates an action potential. So there's a way for the mind to induce the neuron to fire. And in the brain-to-mind interface, the idea that an action potential propagates throughout the neuron is relatively new. And this shows a visual where it was actually shown that the usual mechanism is that the action potential goes down just the axon, but it's clear that the action potential goes throughout the entire neuron. Similarly, in the mind-to-brain interface, we suspect that these ion channels in layer 5 dendrites, the mind can trigger them. Now I'd like to present a little more detail about the mind-entity hypothesis to give a sense how the mind and brain work together in this view. The basic model of the mind is no longer an organ that produces consciousness, but an organ that interfaces between the body and the mind. So the neurological function should now be viewed as the result of two processes. First, neurological processes in the brain, and second, the non-material mind as the seat of the person's consciousness. And the two processes work together. So to reiterate, in ordinary consciousness, the mind is completely dependent on the brain to become conscious. Benjamin Libet, shown here, found that there is a process we call coming to awareness, where there needs to be a minimum duration of electrical activity for a stimulus to come to consciousness, generally a third to a half a second. Sensory awareness doesn't happen instantly. There's a similar process, which we call coming to decision, where awareness of volition doesn't happen instantly either. So a decision is first made and the concept is first thought subliminally, and the decision or thought comes to consciousness after the mental action is reflected in the brain's neural activity. You have to wait for your decision to happen, to be reflected into neural activity, for you then to be conscious of, oh yeah, I decided that. I decided that, and I realized that I decided that earlier. And in this way, the brain seems to hold back consciousness. It provides resistance to consciousness, and this, of course, is confirmed by NDEers who report lucid thoughts and awareness while outside their bodies. In this theory, memories are stored in the mind, not in the brain, but the processes of episodic memory formation and recall are facilitated by a brain structure called the hippocampus. And there are dual pathways to support this. As an experience occurs, the sensory, motor, and mental neural components activate hippocampal neurons at the base of your brain and induce memory formation in the mind. And then in the memory recall, the hippocampal cells interface with the mind and reactivate the same sensory and mental neural components, but at a lower intensity. And this would explain why we can't find where the memories are. Yes, there's long-term potentiation, et cetera, but the memories appear to be everywhere in the brain because they're everywhere in the mind. One more question.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. So, I mean, even if you're using terms that a lot of scientists wouldn't recognize, you're making a scientific hypothesis, as
Yes.
I understand it.
Yes.
And you're making a very specific, some extremely specific claims.
Yep.
You know, aside from the idea that the mind entity could help us understand the enigmas of consciousness, you're also making very specific claims about how it interacts with
Yep.
very particular parts of the brain cells.
Yep.
So in science, obviously, if you make a specific claim like that, it's got to be testable, falsifiable.
Yep.
What sorts of experiments are you proposing that would actually convince other scientists that these claims stand up?
Well, it would be nice to be able to get our hands on and work collaboratively with, get our hands on equipment and so on, and work collaboratively with neuroscientists to test the hypothesis that there can be a mind interface, a mind influence on living neurons in vitro, that the mind can interact and generate an action potential. That would be, and that's very easy to set up and do if we can do that. And then to see, you know, if there's something in the cell structures that is not yet known, which would indicate an interface, an energetic interface.
So you would have to get a mind that is not In other words, you'd have to get somebody else's mind to interact with
No,
the cells in vitro.
no, the energetic field of the person, just as we have a healer doing something like this with another person's head, and that evokes certain sensations and experiences, they can use their hand on a neuron and see what happens.